Hi, my name is Peter. I will take you today on a trip through the history and culture of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. This empire we know of today has changed the entire ancient Near East and the entire ancient world to its core. It connected India with Greece, Nubia in Egypt with Anatolia and the Caucasus regions, and made millions of people call it their home. The Persian Achaemenid Empire can be dated roughly between the period of 550 BCE to the coming of Alexander at 330 BCE. The Persian Achaemenid Empire was also the first time when one empire ruled the entire ancient Near East and formed the basis to the Hellenistic empires that controls this region and to other empires. It changed the ancient Near East profoundly, changing the languages in it and influencing the various native languages that were spoken in it. The Persian Achaemenid Empire was well known even before we found, or modern researchers found, primary sources that deal with this empire. The Persian Empire was known as the Empire of Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great, but also of Darius III, that have lost the empire to Alexander. Now, depiction of its kings were very, very popular during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. We know of many works that depict various scenes, historical scenes that happened in this empire. From the Edict of Cyrus allowing the Jews to come back to Judah and build their temple, to other historical instances that were depicted by Renaissance paintings and painters. Even the United Nations building today has in one of its galleries a copy of the famous cylinder of Cyrus, describing the liberation and reformation and development of temples in Babylonia. It's housed today in the United Nations Center. Cyrus, as we know him, was a very important figure in the ancient Near East, in the ancient world, and in our modern world as well. But Cyrus the Great was not the first Cyrus we meet when we examine primary sources from the ancient Near East. If we go back to the Neo-Assyrian period, to the time of the Neo-Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, we hear of the early interactions between kings of the land of Persa, or Parsumash, with the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Let me quote a quote from a royal inscription of Ashurbanipal. After the conquering weapons of the god Ashur has conquered all of the land of Elam and killed its people, Cyrus, the king of the land Parsumash, and Pislume, the king of the land of Khudimiri, kings whose locations are remote and who live on the far side of the land Elam, fear of the deities Ashur, Mulisu, and Ishtar, who resides in the city of Arbela, overwhelmed them, and they became distressed. They sent their envoys with messages of goodwill and peace, with their substantial audience gifts before me, and they kissed my feet. This royal inscription of Ashurbanipal, written in Akkadian, depicts the early generation of the Persian kings that controlled a small, not so small, a swath of land in southwestern Iran of today, called Persa, or today Fars. This royal inscription tells us that even those kings who lived very, very far away from the Neo-Assyrian king were so afraid that they brought tribute to the Neo-Assyrian ruler. And they mention the king of Parsumash, or Parsa, this area. His name was Cyrus. But this wasn't Cyrus the Great. This was his grandfather. If we look at the Achaemenid dynasty, or the dynasty of Persian kings, we find this Cyrus as the grandfather of Cyrus the Great. So this Neo-Assyrian Cyrus lived somewhere in the late 7th century BCE, but was already controlling the area of the core of the Persian Empire, the area of Parsa or Fars. Only during the middle of the 6th century BCE were the kings of this area and the people of this area were able to form alliances and gather enough strength to change the course of their empire or their kingdom and conquer other areas. This was done under the rulership of Cyrus II, the grandson of the Cyrus that we spoke about just now, Cyrus the Great. Nowadays, in modern research, we can reconstruct fairly with confidence the genealogy of the Achaemenid dynasty that ruled over the Persian Achaemenid Empire for roughly 200 years. It started off with Cyrus as the first emperor and continued with kings such as Cambyses, who was famous for his Egyptian campaign that conquered Egypt, and Darius I, who squashed the famous rebellion against him and created, after his successful victory, the Beisutun inscription, which was the first inscription ever deciphered in Akkadian and in Old Persian and in Elamite. Darius the Great was then followed up by Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Darius II, Artaxerxes II and III, Arses, and coming to Darius III, who lost the empire to Alexander. All of those kings were lost in the historical narrative of Iranian history. If we look at the list of kings given by the famous poet and author Ferdowsi in his Book of Kings, the Shahnameh in Persian, we don't find any echoes to those Cyruses and Dariuses that formed the Achaemenid Empire. But we hear at least some clues or remnants that even Ferdowsi was able to gather, like the name of Goshtasp, who was a king, a ruler of Iran during that time, according to Ferdowsi, and he was probably the father of Darius I, and his real name was Hystaspes in Greek, or Asta Aspa in Iranian. When we come to look at the primary sources that tell us the history of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, we are, of course, first encounter sources such as biblical accounts and Greco-Roman literature that famously described the lavish life of the Persian palace, of the Persian aristocracy, their wars against Greece, and the building of temples that were allowed after the rule of Cyrus. such as the Judean temple, the second temple that was built in Jerusalem after Cyrus and the following Achaemenid kings allowed the Judeans to go back home and to build their temple. Those accounts nowadays are augmented by a horde of tens, if not more than 100,000 primary sources in various languages that describe the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Some of them are royal inscriptions, like the royal inscription in Beisutun, the first inscription ever deciphered in Akkadian, in Old Persian, and in Elamite. Some other are legal and administrative documents from the capital of the Persian Empire, or one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, Persepolis, the city of the Persians. In this city, we know that archaeologists found a large hoard of tablets amounting to more than 10,000 of text, mostly written in the native language of southwestern Iran, which is Elamite. We also have texts in other languages that describe historical events and the period of the Persian Achaemenid rule over its territory. Those were written in Aramaic, the major lingua franca of the Achaemenid Empire. We find many letters that were written in Aramaic from the most peripheral places in the Persian Achaemenid Empire. And they tell us very interesting stories about the lives of the local population, let's say on the south of modern Egypt, or in the area of Afghanistan. But they also tell us about Persian princes that we know from Greco-Roman or Judean sources that moved around this area and governed these vast lands. Those mostly were written in Aramaic. We have many sources in Aramaic, several thousands of them, mostly written on ostraka or on parchment. We also have tens of thousands of other texts in Akkadian from the area of Babylonia, modern Iraq. They also tell us a very interesting story about how the Persians were able to subdue and control the former Neo-Babylonian center and were able to exploit the vast urban cities of Babylonia. Most of those sources were written in Akkadian, sometimes with Aramaic notations on their sides. Now, in this linguistic overview of the sources for the study of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, we lack one important source, which is the Iranian languages. I haven't mentioned them almost at all. Now, the official dialect of Iranian that was common in the Persian Achaemenid Empire is today referred to as Old Persian. We have very little in way of primary sources written in Old Persian. The most important one of them is the Beisutun inscription. We don't have many other sources for Old Persian. For Iranian religion, we lack sources as well. In this overview of sources for the history of the Achaemenid Empire, I did not mention many sources in Iranian languages, which naturally one would think would constitute the main corpus at our disposal. The main language of the core of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, Old Persian, as we know of it or we call it today, was not used for legal and administrative matters, was not used for letters, and was seldomly used in general. We know only of several inscriptions written in this language, some of them very long, like the Beisutun inscription, but the sources are rather limited. We also know of a large corpus of Zoroastrian religious text written in the language of the Avesta, the sacred language of Iran and of the Zoroastrians. But those sources are very late. And although most of them probably date to the 2nd and the 1st millennium BCE, they describe a historical reality and religious atmosphere of areas that are not in modern Iran or in southwestern Iran, the core of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, but of the areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan of today. So their use is rather limited. We are left with other sources, other primary sources that describe this empire, but most of them were not written in Iranian languages. If we go and have a look at the legal and administrative texts at our disposal and letters, we find that in every place under the control of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, a certain administrative bureaucratic system was formed and writing happened. We have many primary sources from Egypt, from Israel, modern Israel, from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq of today, Mesopotamia of ancient times, and Iran itself. Most of them were written in the local languages of those areas. In southern Israel, modern Israel, we found thousands of ostraca from the bureaucratic or administrative system that worked in the area of the Shfela and the Negev, in parts of the Negev. We also find similar administrative systems that created tens of thousands of texts in Babylonia and in Egypt. In Egypt, they were written in the Demotic language and script. In Babylon, they were written in Babylonian, in cuneiform. In other places, like Afghanistan, they were written in Aramaic. We even have several examples of texts that were written in Persepolis itself, in southwestern Iran of today, in Greek or in other Anatolian languages. So we know that the basic bureaucratic system of the Achaemenid Empire was multilingual. This, of course, echoes the famous Esther Scroll that speaks about the multitude of languages that were spoken in the realm of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. And we see this multilingualism especially in the center of the empire, in cities like Babylon, which became one of the capitals of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, Ecbatana, Hamadan of today, Susa, the famous Shushan, where the story of the Esther Scroll happened, and Persepolis. In those areas, in those big capital cities, we know of an influx of migrants and exiles that were either brought there willingly or unwillingly and became part of the society and the life in these new multilingual centers. So it's not that the Persian Achaemenid Empire only ruled over many peoples and languages. Those peoples and languages traveled to its center and affected it to its core. We know that the administration of the Achaemenid Empire itself functioned in a bilateral or in a bilingual or a multilingual state. We have evidence of texts being copied from Elamite and translated to Aramaic in the same bureaucratic organization. We also have Babylonian texts that were copied on parchment. And we have a knowledge of hundreds, if not thousands, of alphabetic scribes that were in the service of the Persian Achaemenid Empire and were stationed in big cities and in small settlements throughout the Persian Achaemenid Empire, only to write and add to the bureaucratic system that formed the basis of the control of this empire. And one can say that this administrative background and bureaucracy, very large bureaucracy of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, were also maybe one of the contributing factors to the fact that the Persians were able to control such a vast area for more than 200 years. Now, if we now stop with the overview of primary sources, as it is endless, we have so many of them, let's speak about the history of how it all began. So, around 550 or so, we first hear of Cyrus trying to change the fate of his kingdom from his small nucleus kingdom located in southwestern Iran. Cyrus, like his father before him, was a vassal of the Median Empire, that were the neighbors of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and controlled the Caucasus, Armenia, and large parts of western Iran of today, especially along the Zagros Mountains. This Median Empire was controlled during the time of Cyrus by King Astyages, or Astyages. We know that at a certain point, around 550, Cyrus decides to go into battle and revolt against the Median kings. And he is successful in that. In 549 BCE, he is able to conquer most of the Median Empire. But he didn't stop there. From Armenia, he continued to the area of Anatolia and fought the Lydians and captured their capital, Sardis, circa 547 BCE. In the years to follow, between 547 and 539, Cyrus continued conquering areas in the region of the Levant itself and started his battles with the Neo-Babylonian Empire and its last king, Nabonide. Nabonide, who was not a very popular king, one might say, in some areas of Babylon, eventually was thrown from his throne at 539 BCE, and Cyrus entered Babylon, creating his new empire that stretched from India to the area of the southern Levant of today. In later periods, we see more and more territories added to the Persian Achaemenid Empire. And during the reign of Darius I, in 525 BCE until 486 BCE, we already have the full extent of the Persian Empire, coming to the region of Greece and the Black Sea, to Egypt and to the Indus Valley, and even controlling parts of Central Asia. So this huge empire did not only conquer the Neo-Babylonian Empire, it conquered the entire known world, the oikumene, as it is called in Greco-Roman sources. This new founded empire, with its large and very complicated bureaucracy, did not only create wealth, it created many stories about it and many histories of peoples that lived under it. One figure, one royal figure from the Achaemenid Empire was very important to various population groups that lived inside the Persian Achaemenid Empire. And that is the image of Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, and the first king. Now, one thinks that if a foreign king comes to your doorstep and conquers your land, he will be viewed in a negative light. However, most of the accounts that we know of about Cyrus are very positive in nature. Let's read some of them. The first one would be of Xenophon. In the Chiropedia, he writes the following. Thus, as we meditated on this analogy, we were inclined to conclude that for man, as he is constituted, it is easier to rule over any and all other creatures than to rule over men. But when we reflected that there was one, Cyrus, the Persian, who reduced to obedience a vast number of men and cities and nations, we were then compelled to change our opinion and decide that to rule men might be a task neither impossible nor even difficult, if one should only go about it in an intelligent manner. At all events, we know that people obeyed Cyrus willingly, although some of them were distant from him a journey of many days, and others of many months. Others, although they had never seen him, and still others who knew well that they never should see him. Nevertheless, they were all willing to be his subjects. This is a Greco-Roman account over Cyrus. Let's read a different one. Maybe from the Bible, from the book of Ezra. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord, spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up to Jerusalem in Judah and build a temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and may their God be with them. Those are the words of Ezra, describing the proclamation or the edict of Cyrus that allowed Judeans to go back to Jerusalem and build the second temple. As you can see here, Cyrus is not only a king, he is a vessel of God himself, who has given him all the kingdoms and appointed him, specifically Cyrus, to build a temple in Jerusalem. This is a very favorable light for such a monarch. Finally, let's go to an historical account written by a Babylonian, probably a Babylonian priest, sitting in the main temple of Babylon, the Sagila temple, who wrote a very polemic piece of work, of literature, against Nabunai, the last king of Babylon. And he mentions there Cyrus as well. Let's see the role Cyrus functioned, or Cyrus was given, in such a polemic text from the heart of the Babylonian world. Okay, the same Babylonian world and the same capital that was the capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He, Cyrus, then proclaimed the peace of the citizens of Babylon. To Marduk, king of the gods, he did obedience. Their reverence to the Lord of Lords was placed firmly in his heart. His heart carried him with joy. He carried the basket, perfected the wall of Babylon by himself, like Nebuchadnezzar, out of his own desire to do this. The gods of Babylon, male and female, he then returned to their chapels. The deities of the gods which they abandoned, he, meaning Cyrus, then returned them to their shrines. And so he put their hearts at rest and made their innards rejoice. So this is an account from a Babylonian priest, part of the Babylonian elite. And it also looks very, very favorably at Cyrus, even comparing him with the greatest king, the greatest Neo-Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, and suggesting that Cyrus by himself wanted to rebuild the temples and do it from the goodness of his heart. So all of these depictions depict Cyrus as a unique figure in history, one that is revered by many people, and one that is known in history books until today. So, if one thing that is left with us from the Persian Achaemenid Empire, it may be how to rule and what does a good ruler do, in various situations, and of course the historical image of Cyrus as a savior to many people. The same Cyrus is also very famous from his edict allowing people to go back home and build, let's say, the temple in Jerusalem. We know that during the Neo-Babylonian period, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people were exiled from their homes in order to build the heart of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq of today. Those people were not allowed to leave their new homes in exile and go back to their original homes. We even hear, or we know of, royal inscriptions and proclamations that were put probably in various areas of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, warning people not to harbor fugitives or exiles that try to run away and go back home. And those who will help exiles go back home or fugitives will die. Now, this was the situation during the Neo-Babylonian Empire. However, as we just discussed, Cyrus allowed everyone to go back home. And we know from the biblical sources that many did return during the period of Ezra and even earlier, and built the second temple in Jerusalem. However, we also find primary sources in archaeological excavation that speak of a similar situation for other nations. The people of Nerab, a small city next to Aleppo, into modern Syria, were also exiled from their homes during the Neo-Babylonian period, at the early 3rd of the 6th century BCE. They were exiled from Syria to Babylonia, to southern Babylonia, and lived there in general proximity to other exiled nations like the Judeans. After the conquest of the Neo-Babylonian Empire by the Persians, and after Cyrus's edict, we hear, or we know, that those people from a little town called Nerab packed up their belongings in Babylon and did the long march back home, thousands of kilometers of march. Probably they didn't march, they went on boats or on donkeys. And then the community that lived in southern Babylonia decided also to go back home in similar fashion to the Judeans that also went back from Babylon to Judah. Those people that lived in Nerab in Syria lived for generations, for 2 or 3 generations, in Babylonia. They called their settlement in Babylonia after their old town. Thus, there was Nerab in Babylonia and Nerab in Syria. But when they packed their things, their belongings in Babylonia to go back home, they took those texts with them to Nerab in Syria. And that is the point where modern archaeology comes to our aid. And those texts were unearthed not far from Aleppo, in the ancient town of Nerab in modern Syria, although they speak about southern Babylonia. We have around 27 Babylonian cuneiform texts from the archive of people of the town of Nerab. They depict a very similar situation to that of the Judeans that lived not far away from them in Babylonia. With all this positive light over the return of many people and the proclamation of Cyrus that allowed people to go back to their homes, we shouldn't forget that in the same time, especially during the reign of Darius I, but also probably of all the other Persian Achaemenid kings, tens of thousands of people from different parts of the Persian Achaemenid Empire were brought as workforce to the central cities and regions of the Persian Achaemenid Empire in order to build the lavish palaces of the Persian kings, the huge canals that connected Babylonia and Iran and other places, to build fortresses and little post offices or administrative centers. Those were all done by work groups, mostly foreign work groups that were brought to this area and made to work in this new system, because those palaces were not built by themselves. They were built in the sweat of many people under the rule of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Here's an account coming from an old Persian royal inscription from the time of Darius. It was found in Susa. I'll read you the English translation of this account. The stonemasons who worked the stone to build the palace of Susa, those were Ionians and Lydians. The goldsmiths who made the gold, those were Medians and Egyptians. The people who made the wood, those were Lydians and Egyptians. The people who made the bricks, those were Babylonians. The people who decorated the walls, those were Medians and Egyptians. So, a royal inscription that was put to commemorate the foundation of one of the palaces of Darius I in Susa describes the people that built the palace. Not surprisingly, we do not hear of any Iranian in this account. We only hear about Egyptians and Lydians and Babylonians and Greeks, etc., that built the palace. Each nation had a specific specialty. Let's say the Babylonians are well known in brick making, so they built the bricks. But the stonemasons were Ionians and Lydians. Ionia is an umbrella term for Greeks that lived on islands, the area of Ionia in Anatolia, but also sometimes in old Persian accounts, mainland Greece. So we hear that Ionians were stonemasons, which is not surprising if one thinks about Greeks in this period. But we also find graffiti not far from Persepolis that date to the Persian Achaemenid Empire, and in a quarry next to the big city of Persepolis, where some Greeks left their names as graffiti over the walls of this quarry. So the account that we just read, where Ionians were stonemasons, can be augmented by the simple fact that graffitis bearing Greek names and in Greek were found not far from Persepolis in a quarry in a place called Koher Ahmat in Iran. We also see sometimes in the Persepolis archive, the administrative archive, that depicts the bureaucracy of the central capital of the Persian Empire. We also find text, at least one text in Greek, that depicts rations for Greeks. So here we see how foreigners and non-foreigners created the lavish palaces that were the house of the Persian Achaemenid kings, and the vast bureaucratic system that depended on workers to take barley, pay it to whoever needs it as food rations, to build things, to dig canals, and to participate in the war campaigns of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. The Persian Achaemenid rule over the entire empire has brought about many people that wanted to travel to the capitals of the Persian Empire, such as Persepolis and Susa and Ecbatana and Babylon. those cities were the main hubs where the king was present and his court. So many people, especially entrepreneurs that wished to gain a good contract with the Persian bureaucracy in their native land, or do business in a place where money is abundant, traveled to those areas. But the travel to the area of Fars, or Persa in ancient times, to Persepolis and to the area of Elam and to Susa, was rather difficult. It involved a long march or a long boat ride of hundreds of kilometers, sometimes thousands of kilometers, to just come to the court before even doing business. Those trips were rather dangerous. And we have accounts, such as the one that I will read right now, of people that died during the trip to these places. This account that I will read right just now comes from a very important Babylonian family of entrepreneurs that worked with the Persian Achaemenid bureaucracy and tried to gain good contracts with the Persian Achaemenid bureaucracy in order to benefit economically and socially from their work together with the Persian overlords. One of the members of this family started a trip to Iran. His name was Idin Marduk, and thus goes his account. This was written in Babylonian, but I will read it in English. Idin Marduk, son of Nabu Mukin Apli, descendant of the Agibi family, fell seriously ill on the shores of the Lower Sea, which is the Persian Gulf, and assessed his assets, a share to be divided among his sons, and a dowry for his wife to be given. Afterwards come the discussion of who gets what. But one might think about Idin Marduk falling seriously ill somewhere in the middle of his trip to the capital and writing this, and thinking that even when you want to visit your Persian overlords, you should remember that the trip is very dangerous and long. Other people did not go willingly to the capitals of the Persian Empire. We hear that Babylonian temples, such as the Eanna temple in Uruk, needed to send workers to work in the Persian capitals. Here's a letter written by an official from the Eanna temple that describes this situation. It was written in Babylonian, but I will read it in English. Letter of Nidintu to Nadinu, my lord. See, I pray daily to Bel, Nabu, the lady of Uruk, and Anaya, for my lord's health. Those are all Babylonian gods. Long days, happiness, and well-being. 37 workers are being sent to Humadeshu, a city in very close proximity, several kilometers far from Persepolis. See, they will arrive there before my lord. To those people, please give 6 cores of barley, 6 cores of dates, 12 shekels of silver, a specific garment, etc., etc. And also, of course, the letter states that each worker should be given 2 pairs of sandals and 1 leather bag and oil and cress for the year. And especially donkeys, food for their donkeys for the trip from the area of Uruk in southern Iraq of today to the central capital of the Persian Empire, Persepolis, and the slave center city called Humadeshu, which was located several kilometers from it. There, the workers from the Babylonian temple probably worked on infrastructure and building buildings and other works that the Persian Achaemenid Empire needed in order to build this little city called Humadeshu. Humadeshu is very well known as an important economic center, especially in the slave trade industry. We know of many slaves from all the vast regions of the Persian Achaemenid Empire that were brought there from places such as Bactria and from India and from Egypt. They were all brought and sold in Humadeshu. We also hear about low-ranking people and population groups that were forced to do work for their Persian overlords. One such account comes from the town of Judah, but in Babylonia, not Jerusalem. This account was written for a Judean by the name of Shalamyahu, the son of Nuba. Shalamyahu, the son of Nuba, needed to do work for 2 months in Susa, but didn't want to leave his comfortable home in southern Babylonia, in the town of Judah. So he found a replacement, a person, and he paid him. And thus goes the contract between them that was written in Babylonian. Zabudu, son of Iltamesh Chaza, will do 2 months of service for the king in the land of Elam, meaning Susa, on behalf of Shalamyahu, son of Nuba, where the colleagues of Shalamyahu will perform the king's service. Zabudu has received from Shalamyahu for his service the following: 5 shekels of silver, 120 liters of flour, 1 liter of oil, cress, salt, 1 leather bag, 1 pair of sandals. If Zabudu abandons them and goes somewhere else, he will bear this guilt against the king. In the 11th and 12th months of the 10th year of Darius I, he will go to Elam, meaning he will go to Susa. This trip is around 200 kilometers if you go on a straight line. It was probably a lot longer and took several weeks to go there. And this text depicts that not only people from important institutions were sent, or specialized workers, but ordinary people were sent to build palaces for the Persian Achaemenid Empire. It didn't matter if you were exiled and lived in Babylonia as an exile, or you were a native to Babylonia. You all went and built palaces and other things for the Persian overlord. As I've mentioned, the vast conquests of the Persian Achaemenid Empire resulted, of course, naturally, with a lot of slaves that were caught and captured during these military campaigns. Waves of foreign slaves were sold on various markets throughout the Persian Achaemenid Empire. I have mentioned one such center, at the core of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, near the city of Persepolis, the city of Humadeshu, which was well known for being an economic center for the slave trade industry. But people were sold and bought regularly on the markets of various cities throughout the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Here is an interesting story of a foreign slave that was sold in the city of Sipar, in northern Babylonia of today, not far from Baghdad in modern times. This economic text that was written in Babylonian mentions the following. Idi Nabu, son of Ninurta Nur Ukin, Bel Ikbi, son of Ninurta Ach Utsur, voluntarily sold Tahal, their slave woman, whose wrist is inscribed in Egyptian, to the woman Achat Abisha, daughter of Kirbitaya. This text was drafted in Sipar in the month of Shvat, the second day, first year of Xerxes, king of Persia, Media, king of Babylon, and all the lands. Now, the story here seems straightforward. Yes, 2 people sold their female slave to another woman. All of the people that were involved in the purchasing and the selling seemed to be, at least from their names, Babylonian. But the female slave has an inscription on her wrist inscribed in Egyptian. In Akkadian, this would sound something like Sharitashu Mitzarata Shatratu. Now, if we look at the name of this slave woman, we can understand it in Egyptian under the transliteration Tahrat. her name in Egyptian means the Syrian woman. So it begs the question, why did a female slave whose wrist is inscribed in Egyptian and her Egyptian name tells us at least that from her name, she was a Syrian woman? One can explain this sort of bizarre situation happening not in Egypt, not in Syria, but in Babylonia, in the following manner. Tahrat received her name when she was sold in a slave market in Syria. She was probably sold to an Egyptian. Sometime later, she was brought to Egypt and had her wrist inscribed in Egyptian in order to show that her new owner owned her. His name was probably inscribed on her wrist. When the Persian Achaemenid Empire came to Egypt and controlled it, people were able to sell slaves from various regions of the empire. So Tahrat was probably sold again and moved again from Egypt this time to Babylonia, then to be sold again and again and again. Now this difficult passage, which tells the tragedy of the slave woman, also presents us with a foreign slave trade network that spread throughout the empire, when people are moved and are moving constantly, free people and not free people. But everybody can move throughout the realm and do business, sell and buy from the areas of India to Egypt and even Anatolia. And one can see that even a boring legal and administrative document can tell us huge amounts of information, historical information, regarding the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Now, the foreigners were very, very important, not only in the provinces or the kingdoms where they come from, where they originated from. No, they were also important at the center of the Persian Empire, because of their speciality sometimes, because of their special knowledge that they possessed, but also because of the knowledge of languages. Most of the foreigners that we meet in the Persian administration were involved in writing. Most of them wrote in Aramaic or in other languages and were part of the mechanism of scribes that formed the backbone of the Persian bureaucracy. Now, if one imagines himself as an exile or a foreigner coming to these huge cities like Susa or Ecbatana or Persepolis or Babylon, and trying to find a way to live there and maybe move up the social ladder, have a good paycheck or something, one does not think immediately that foreigners would be so welcomed by the basic bureaucratic system that was in charge over these areas. But they were. Many of the administrators that we know of are in origin foreign to those central places. Many of them were scribes, but we also hear of courtiers in the court, in the Persian court. We hear of foreigners working as architects, as carpenters, as gardeners, as sailors, as soldiers, and even monkey trainers in those central cities. Of course, we also hear about foreigners working in low-scale work, such as being shepherds, plowmen, gardeners, hired workers, wine or oil pressers, etc., etc. But what we know is that most of these foreigners were actually able to climb through the social ladder by using their role in the administration. They started off small, as being a scribe in a small peripheral station or a small warehouse belonging to the Persian bureaucracy, and made their way up, just like Ezra the scribe or Nehemiah, both very important figures in Jewish history that rose to prominence through the Persian administration and gained their status and position in society through being part of the Persian administration. So this situation is rather peculiar because most of the bureaucracies and royal administrative mechanisms that we know of from the ancient Near East did not try and incorporate foreigners into their mechanism. This was mainly probably because of the knowledge of those people in the most important language of the realm, Aramaic, who became the lingua franca of the entire Persian Achaemenid Empire. Now, those foreigners living in the central urban cities at the heart of the Persian Empire created little enclaves where they lived, little colonies or neighborhoods where they all gathered. And we hear very interesting stories from these exiled or foreign communities living in those places. Here's an account that comes from a contract written in Babylonian, in Akkadian, from the Egypto-Babylonian community that resided in Susa, which is today in Western Iran. A Babylonian woman by the name of Belesunu, on her own volition, gave Kusigu, probably a name of West Semitic origins, her daughter, for several months of the 18th year of King Artaxerxes, to Shushana, the singer, the daughter of Zababa Eresh. Both of those names are probably Babylonian, in order of becoming a musician. The text then continues with what should she learn, what happens if she doesn't, if she fails in being a musician, etc., etc., and is concluded by a mixed witness list involving people with Iranian names like Bagadata, people with West Semitic or Egyptian names like Padi Essi, and Babylonian names like Nanaya Eresh. So this is a foreign community that formed the backbone of the Persian administration, but also created life and new opportunities in those places. The Persian Achaemenid Empire, as I just discussed, was formed from many, many nations. And those nations affected the periphery, but also the center, bringing their culture and history and languages to those centers. I've discussed this at length in the last minutes. But I would like to show you some of the fashion trends and other trends that happened at the centers, the big urban centers of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. We have several instances where Egyptian materials, commodities, and clothes, and even food appear in Babylonian texts and in texts that were found in the area of southwestern Iran of today, the central area of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. We know that during the reign of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, especially during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, Egyptian culture was considered in a very positive light throughout the ancient Near East and the Persian Achaemenid Empire. We hear of Egyptian ducks being eaten in feasts in Persepolis, a very famous and popular dish at the center, in the central cities of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Also, we find in the archaeology of those areas Egyptian-styled vessels that were considered luxury items. Finally, we hear of Egyptians that are bringing their culture in very interesting and unpredictable way to those centers. Here is a very interesting account of one Babylonian that lived in Babylon during the 5th century BCE and had a special request from his Egyptian slave. I'll read you just a part of it in English. Minu ana Bel Dan, this person, son of Bel Bulisu, by his own free will, has sent Bel Edu Utsur, his Egyptian captive slave, to learn the craft of bread baking, of Egyptian bread. Here we find a contract where a Babylonian in Babylon sends his Egyptian captive slave to learn the craft of baking Egyptian bread. One wonders, why does an Egyptian need to know how to bake Egyptian bread? But this is, of course, a very difficult ordeal. You have to know the ingredients, how much time to put it in the oven, what kind of oven do you need, if you need an oven at all or not. But we know from this account and from several similar accounts that Egyptian bread was all the fashion in the centers of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. We also hear sometimes of Egyptian garments and Egyptian linen that was very famous and is famous until today, that was sold to various people in Babylonia by Egyptians. Here is an account of a Babylonian person working in one of the most central temples in the city of Sipar in northern Babylonia during the 6th century BC. This person was accused of stealing linen from the main deity of this temple, the Lady of Sipar, a very important deity in Sipar. Now, this person, a Babylonian that worked in the temple, was brought to court and said and declared to court as follows: I did not steal the linen. I purchased the garment from an Egyptian person in the presence of several people in exchange for a payment in flour and dates. So we can hear, at least from this little court record, a very interesting fact. A Babylonian that is working in the temple of Sipar was accused of stealing garments and linen from the deity, the main deity in the temple where he worked. And he, to his defense, declared that he purchased the specific Egyptian garment from an Egyptian person. Now, this might be just an account of an historical fact that happened to certain people that is not so very important to our lives. But it also mentions people of foreign Egyptian origin that are trading in Egyptian linen and Egyptian garments in Babylon, and thus using their ethnic connections and extraction in order to better their lives in their new cities that they live in. Now we come to a very interesting religious question. The Iranian religion, as we know it from the Zoroastrian text, was, if one speaks about it in general terms, was a mirror image, or not a mirror image, but the Iranian religion that we know of from Zoroastrian texts tell us of problems and religious problems and a strife and even a quarrel between the Iranian religious worldview and the Indian one. In one of those cases, we know that certain Indian priests were considered as evil by Iranian sacred texts. Here is a quote from the Avesta, the ancient Iranian religious text, that mentions the role of the Indian priest called the Kalapan. Through their powers, the Kalapans and Kavis yoke a mortal one together with evil actions in order to destroy his existence. Their own soul and their own religious view will recoil from them when they will have reached the place of the account keeper's bridge for all time guests attached to the house of deceit. This quote from the Avesta describes in very negative light Indian priests that were titled Kalapan. They are evil, their actions are evil, and they cannot ever, their soul cannot ever find its peace and rest. But we hear of such priests traveling all the way from the Indus Valley to Persepolis, the capital of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, probably with a special permission by the king, together with 180 servants and various helpers and a whole court. And these people traveled from India to Persepolis. So why do we have an Indian priest that is sent forth from the king back to India and to Persepolis before that? In Persepolis, if this kind of priest is seen in such a negative light by Iranian religious worldview? Well, we don't have an answer, a clear answer about this. But this text, this economics text that I just mentioned, that details the travels of these Indian priests back and forth from the king to India and from India to the king, describe maybe parts of the religious tolerance that was in place in the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Even for the worst kind of priests or religious views, those did not stop them from traveling and doing business and affairs, even with very high-ranking people in the bureaucratic mechanism of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, and brings a lot of thoughts about the idea of religious tolerance that we see in the Edict of Cyrus and in other places in the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Finally, those urban cities and urban centers that flourished and were considered home by many different people of different ethnic extractions that all came together and lived in these important cities, has also brought an important thing for us all. And that is scientific knowledge that moves from one place to the other, allowing us to know better our world and many other things in it. I will tell you a story of one such person. His name was Kidinu. Kidinu lived in Babylon, probably at during the 4th century BCE. He was a subject of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, at least for parts of his life. And he was a very known astronomer and mathematician. Among other things, Kidinu is known to have measured the lunation length that we know of today. Yes, 29 days, and etc., etc. This lunation length was then confirmed by Hipparchus, and Ptolemy accepted it, and even Hillel used it in the Hebrew calendar. Kidinu is also mentioned hundreds of years later by Strabo in his famous work on geography. Strabo tells us about the story of Kidinu and Babylonian science in general. In Babylon, a residence was set apart for the native philosophers called Chaldeans, who were chiefly devoted to the study of astronomy. Some, who are not approved by the rest, profess to understand genealogy or casting of nativities. There are several classes of Chaldean astronomers. Some have the name of Orcheni. Those people probably are coming from Uruk, Urukians. Some Bolsipieni, people living in the city of Bolsipa. And many others, as if divided into sects, who disseminate different tenets on the same subject. The mathematicians make mentions of some individuals among them, as Kidinias, Naburianis, and Sudinus, and many other remarkable men. So Strabo, hundreds of years after Kidinu has passed away, still remembers that there was this famous mathematician and astronomer living in Babylon. Kidinu was known, as we can see in Greco-Roman sources, and his lunation calculations affected not only Babylonia, but the entire ancient Near East, and affects us today. Kidinu was also, in the modern 20th century, became the name of an important crater, an impact crater on the face of the moon that was named after him because of his important role in the study of the moon. So we see how one Babylonian person living and working probably in a Babylonian temple was able to affect us all until today. And this in much is maybe the most important contribution of the Persian Achaemenid Empire to the history of the world. The ability of people to move from place to place, exchange knowledge of math and science and literature and many other things, and create new knowledge on the basis of what they heard from other people, coming from other places. Because this is the basis of all of our knowledge until today, the accumulation of it from various parts and the use of it, even until modern times. So, in sum, in this lecture, we did an overview of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, the empire that was founded circa 550 BCE and lasted until 330 BCE. The empire that controlled large swathes and most of the ancient known world of ancient times, from the region of the Indus Valley until Anatolia and Nubia, to Egypt and to many other places. And the Persian Achaemenid Empire controlled millions of people and allowed them to move from place to place. It needed an efficient bureaucratic mechanism in order to control these areas, and military campaigns were abundant, and so was exile that brought many people as a cheap labor force to the centers of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. Those people built the large palaces that one can see today in archaeology, or small road stations that we can see throughout the periphery in areas like Afghanistan and even Judah of today, where we find these kinds of administrative centers in the archaeological record. The Persian Achaemenid Empire controlled all of these areas, but also allowed people from various ethnic extractions to be part of its administrative bureaucracy and gain status in this new society. And thus, people of modest ethnic extractions, such as Ezra and Nehemiah, that were coming from exiled families, Judean exiled families, and living in Babylon, were able to make their career in the Persian Achaemenid Empire, coming to become very important scribes, like Ezra, who had a saying with the king, or the Nehemiah, who held one of the most important positions in the Persian Achaemenid Empire and was appointed as governor of Judah and Jerusalem, and built the famous walls that we know from his time. So those were the main mechanisms that the Persian Achaemenid Empire used in order to control the area and the people, but also allowing them to benefit from the new reality that they lived in. And this situation and strategy that was used by the Persian kings brought fame, of course, to them in the image of Cyrus or Darius as great kings and just kings, but also in the ability of knowledge to move all the way from India to Babylonia and to Greece, and to affect us all until today, as we saw with the example of Kidinu. So thank you very much. Goodbye.